Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history, and his argument was quite simple. He said that liberal democracy was essentially the end point of mankind's ideological evolution. Well, 3 decades on, it sounds like a premature declaration. Today, our world is radically polarized. Ideologies are constantly challenging what were believed to be settled political arrangements for societies, for communities, and for countries. So in this session, we are going to deliberate what we're calling the revenge of ideology, polarization and the exhaustion of liberalism. And with me are some of the most qualified speakers on this subject, who've led countries and institutions, who've all witnessed this political evolution over the years in different parts of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Teodoro L. Locsin Jr., Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Philippines; Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister, Sweden, and co-chair of European Council on Foreign Relations; Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister of Canada; Bijayant Panda, National Vice President of the Bharatiya Janata Party, India; and Jane Hall-Lute, former Deputy Secretary, Department of Homeland Security, United States. Good morning to all of you again. Let's start with Mr. Locsin. Is liberalism, according to you, an obsolete doctrine? That's what Vladimir Putin once said. Or at the very least, would you say that this is a concept that is in retreat?
Well, first, good morning. I'm honored to be here in Raisina with such a distinguished panel. And thank you for the list of issues. Without it, it'd be shooting in the dark or giving big theories which don't help. On that question, liberalism is not obsolete. The attraction of its democratic expression remains strong. The generation after the one that threw Catholic nuns out of helicopters over the Atlantic is at the forefront of democracy advocacy and human rights campaigns. So it waxes and wanes. But if liberalism is indeed retreating, on what basis can the world come together? My answer, liberalism with body armor and the accoutrements of a serious fight. This is not rhetoric, but reality, like in Ukraine, once a cesspool of corruption and a playpen of oligarchs. It is now the stage where Ukrainians, given the choice to surrender or die, reach for immortality by positioning themselves for a last stand with the sea at their backs. Surrender is never an option. That's to borrow from Bolton's phrase. Thank you, ma'am.
My next question is to Carl Bildt. Liberalism has been called, and I'm quoting, an expansionist imperial project, a narrow Western-defined idea of progress whose time is up. Do you agree with this assessment?
I don't.
Yes.
Sorry, no, I don't with that particular, no, I don't. But going back to your original question, the Fukuyama quote, when he wrote the book about sort of models of governance. Well, models of governance has always been sort of a fundamental issue throughout history. The way in which we govern our societies is important for the way in which they develop. And my thesis would be that the sort of open and representative types of governance, you can call it liberal or you can call it even democratic if you want to, that is the model of governance that is going to endure. And why is that? That is because we live in extremely dynamic times. And the way in which governance can adapt to changed circumstances is the way in which they assure their long-term survival. If you have a more autocratic, a more closed, a more static form of governance, that will sooner or later be subject to such forces that will try to change it, that it risks collapse. And I think that if we were able to see the longer trajectory of some of the autocratic governance models that we see in the world today, you will see that sooner or later they will be subject to immense strain because they don't have the possibility to adapt freely, that they will be in serious crisis. So I do believe that the history does show, I'm with Fukuyama in that particular respect, that the open, representative, adaptable systems of governance are the ones that have the best chances of not only survival, but also success, also in our modern times.
Stephen Harper, the two speakers before you have both voted for liberalism, and yet we see instances across the world. Would you say that Donald Trump's attack on democracy or Britain's rejection of Europe were the biggest blows to the liberal order?
Look, just to maybe back up and answer the big question, I think it's a leap. I've written about the challenges that free and democratic societies face in this day and age, and I think they're very significant, both internally and externally. But I think it's a leap to go from, on the one extreme, what you mentioned at the outset, which was talk about the end of history, now to the end of liberalism. We never were facing the end of history, and we're not facing the end of liberalism. What we have is free and democratic societies under enormous stress for significant reasons, and I do think you need a new generation of leadership to address some of the complexities and challenges that they face. But before we exaggerate how much stress they're under, I mean, let's look at some of the realities. You know, for instance, the victory of Brexit or Donald Trump or the rise of you know, some populist or extreme party is not in and of itself proof of the collapse of liberalism. In fact, you know, what distinguishes, I think, today even so-called extremist parties is they are largely working within the framework of trying to change government through democratic means. This is not the 1930s. Or even later times where there were actually forces trying to overturn the democratic order by violence. So, you know, I think that what we've seen with free and democratic societies over time is when they face challenges, as Carl said, they have shown resilience, the ability to adapt, and I'm confident that's where we're headed again. It may be a messy process, but let's remember something, that in the end, ordinary people want to live in free and democratic societies. Ordinary people would rather be free than not free, and free and democratic societies over long periods of time have a history of delivering far superior outcomes than autocratic and authoritarian societies do. So I think we have significant challenges both internally and externally, but I'm not a pessimist about the future of liberalism or what I call free and democratic society.
And yet what we saw in the US last year was an attempt to overthrow the democratic order through violent means.
Look, I think you had a riot. You did have a president who frankly tried to use actually constitutional means to overturn a result in the Senate. He was unsuccessful, and you had a riot. But you know, the fact is, the system was not actually in danger of being overthrown. And you know, the real challenge, I think, for those who oppose Mr. Trump, and there are good reasons to do so, is to actually have a candidate who can beat him in an election. And as of today, by the way, if you look at polling in the United States, it's not clear that he wouldn't win again. But ultimately, he will either come to power or not come to power through democratic means. I think that's the reality.
Bijoy Panda, in many political conversations these days, the word liberal has become a pejorative, and critics say that democracies became illiberal because liberals became undemocratic. Do you agree with this?
Well, liberalism isn't what it used to be. If you brought back to life any of the founders of classical liberalism, they would not recognize many facets of what passes for liberalism today. And I can cite any number of examples. The debate on what free speech ought to be, the debate on moderating content on the newer internet-based platforms. There are many, many other issues that show up that what those who call themselves liberals today espouse in many ways goes against the individual rights that classical liberalism always fought for and speak up for group rights. So let me give you an Indian example. But before that, I'd just like to point out that Western societies, the very fount of modern liberal thought, are hugely polarized across the political divide. Countries like the US have never seen this kind of polarization in a century and a half. In Canada, in Sweden, you see the effects of that polarization every day on the streets. Now, in India, those who call themselves liberals stand for certain views and principles that no other global liberal could even identify with. So, for example, what passes off as secularism in India actually means by law government control of the places of worship of one religion. You wouldn't accept that as secular, you wouldn't accept that as secular, but this is something we have inherited from colonial times. And those in India who call themselves liberal continue to adhere to this principle of secularism, which is a distorted interpretation. So liberalism in its classical form continues to be robust, is under challenge by those who call themselves liberal today. See what has happened to classical left of center politics in Western countries, taken over by what is called the woke movement. Now, I would say that if you look at classical liberal values, they are still relevant today. They are practiced even by those governments which are often accused of not being liberal. If I want to use an Indian example, under Prime Minister Modi, hundreds of millions of disenfranchised individuals have become empowered over these past few years in many different ways, economically, socially, and if that isn't classical liberalism, I don't know what is.
Very interesting. I'm sure others will have something to say on this. But I'll take the next question to Jane Hall-Lute. What does the war in Ukraine mean for the liberal order? Is it proof of its demise, or is it the opportunity for its revival? Does the world see this war as a demonstration of what the alternative to liberalism would be? And if yes, what explains the victory of Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the rising popularity of Marine Le Pen, even though she lost the election?
I find myself, better? I find myself becoming very emotional about this conversation. I don't think there's a person in this room who doesn't yearn to breathe free. I don't think any of us know anyone who doesn't yearn to breathe free. The liberal values that underscore our mindset, our attitude, our approaches, our interactions, I think are under more than just strain. I'll disagree with Prime Minister Harper. It was not a riot on January 6th, 2021. It was a campaign to overthrow the democratic, duly elected outcome of a United States election. It was poorly done. It was shocking, ultimately unsuccessful. Is that a foregone conclusion the next time? I don't know many people in the United States who think so. Could it happen again? It could happen again. I would say democracy is thriving. Democracy is thriving. There are votes happening everywhere, in all manner of disguises, for all manner of regimes. Liberalism is not happening everywhere. And what are the values of liberalism? Individual freedom, equal treatment under the law, liberty, which is the responsible exercise of freedom. What are we seeing in Ukraine? We're seeing trampling of the values, liberal values that are enshrined in the UN Charter that begins with the word, we the peoples. And what's at stake right now is not whether you focus on liberalism or you focus on democracy. What's at stake is the definition of we. Who exactly is the we we're talking about? And what we are seeing increasingly, whether it's in autocratic regimes or in movements that are reacting to an overreach, whether of the progressives or what are termed liberals, they are redefining the we. And in many cases, in my view, it is very much the 1930s again.
That's a very strong statement. Would you agree then with what Jay Panda said, that that liberalism, or the current form of liberalism, is being challenged because individual freedom is shrinking in liberal societies?
I agree, because people are redefining the we to whom these rights and entitlements are extended. We see it everywhere. We see the global reaction to immigration and migration. They're not us. These rights, these entitlements are for us, for we the people. And we are redefining we. In each of our societies, I don't think there's a country on the planet that's immune from this redefinition of we. And that's what I think we really need to examine.
Right. Mr. Loxton, you said, you asked a question, on what basis will the world come together? I want to ask you the same question. On what basis will the world come together? Can a coalition of democracies uphold liberal values? Can a coalition of democracies take on China? Or will it take more than democracy to bind them? If Russia unites Europe, will China divide it?
I'd like to say that I'm much enriched by the comments of the ones who spoke before me. The most successful free countries have, as far as I can see, no stomach for a fight. It was an alliance of totalitarianism and democracy that won World War II. Today, not a single democracy has boots on Ukrainian ground. Can China be beaten with Russian help? The US wanted to build up China as a commensurate counterweight to the Soviet Union. The experiment was an enormous success, but it took so long to complete that by then the enemy had changed to the United States. Western Europe, on the other hand, I think just wants to keep buying Russian oil and gas by diverting hostility to China. But wait, don't look askance at Germany, for example. It paid its dues in spades to reunite and make the end of the Cold War irreversible, with a united Germany as the only buffer with unforgiving enemies. So I think you have to excuse them for that. Call caution NATO against drawing a new red line to stop Russia from its resurrection. Its drive, I'd like to add that who are we? I think my colleague to my immediate left said this right. Who are we? We are those who choose the next government as the majority, and the winning majority in the next election. And I think that the extreme right wing that some of us may find unpalatable, there was just much right to say when they win that election under Trump, to say, we are democracy. And if the other side takes the next election, then they are democracy. What is important is that the mechanism is never interfered with, that everyone has a chance to take power. So, yeah, thank you.
Carl Bildt, Jane said that this is very similar to the 1930s, and just like that era, Europe is also witnessing a war. Can trade remain insulated from the vagaries of geopolitics? I ask this because Europe has been accused of bankrolling this war for Russia as well. So does Europe believe in and practice the values that it preaches? Does trade shape geopolitics, as seems to be in the case of Europe?
I mean, trade is of course part of it. Trade is a function of the fact that we want to have an open world and open societies. And that means that we have an interaction with other parts of the world, with our societies, also exchanging not only goods, but also services and ideas and people and whatever. And I fail to see that we can have open societies and open economies without also opening up more and more for trade and interaction between societies. At the same time, we now have other models of governance that are trying to be more autocratic also in terms of controlling their economies. And we have, if we go to the Ukraine conflict or the Russian aggression against Ukraine, to be more precise with the language, the necessity to use also economic and trade as part of that political conflict. That has negative effects, no question about that, on the functioning of the global economic order, but that is an expression of the fact that we now have rapidly rising geopolitical tension that is grounded in what, in this particular case, Russia is doing. Let me just say, sort of a comment on some of the others. The fact that we have this vigorous debate here in India or in Europe or in the US about the nature of governance and what is happening is in itself a strength of our liberal societies. We don't have that debate in Russia. We don't have that debate in China. You are thrown in jail if you have the sort of debate that we are having here at Raisina, or that we have throughout the US or throughout Europe. And that means that those systems, they lose the possibility of learning from mistakes, of adapting by an open process of controversies and debates and disputes and all of that. And that means that, to go back to my original thesis, those systems, those regimes are much more fragile than they look, because they will not be able to handle the different challenges of the future, while we, the liberal societies, or call it whatever, by this particular debate and by the controversies and by the problems that we have and by the mistakes that we do, we have the possibility of learn by mistakes and adapt peacefully to change.
Stephen Harper, you've said in the past that in an Indo-Pacific century, India will be its own actor. What will be the common ideological underpinning of alliances going forward?
I think that being liberal, or what I call free and democratic societies, will be important in international alliances going forward, just by the way as they have been in the past 200 years. I actually think if you look back at least to the period of Napoleon, maybe longer, but at least to the period of Napoleon, you see that, and this is not to say that interests, concrete national interests, economic interests, other things are not important, but you do see that over time, there have tended to be, over the past couple of hundred years, global alliances determined to a significant degree by shared value systems, shared governance frameworks. Not perfectly. And I do think this is one area where we should be a little bit careful, for instance, when we're talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Look, there's no doubt in my mind that, you know, the invasion of Russia by Ukraine is actually, you want to talk about the 1930s, this is actually the 1930s. This is essentially a fascistic nationalist government in Russia invading a neighbor with total disregard for any kind of legal framework, international or otherwise, and trying to deny its right to nationhood. You know, as I say, that is the 1930s over again, and there is a tendency for us, because Ukraine was or is a democracy, an imperfect democracy, but Ukraine's certainly democracy, Russia is certainly not. There's a tendency for us to say, well, now this conflict is between democracy and authoritarianism. And certainly in Europe, and certainly in the West, we have seen, I think, a revival of the notion of shared values and what that really means when we face something like Vladimir Putin's government. But we should not exaggerate in the sense that there will be other reasons and other elements that may align with us internationally. For example, you know, I happen to think that it makes a lot of sense if you look at the global alignments that are developing, take the Middle East, where we face a serious challenge from a theocratic regime in Iran. It makes a lot of sense that the traditional monarchies of the Gulf would be allied with the West in this global struggle. They're not today, frankly, because the American government keeps reaching out to their enemies in Tehran. But, you know, as in World War II, when the West, when liberalism allied itself with communism to defeat fascism, I think that sometimes international alliances have value bases. They're not necessarily really strict ones. And I do think in the complex world, the West is going to find that from time to time, we do have to ally ourselves with systems that are different than ours. But importantly, although their systems may be different, they don't threaten our security. And that's what's really critical.
And the traditional monarchies you mentioned are neither democratic nor liberal, but I'll take what you said back to Carl Bildt, and you said that it's shared value systems that form the basis of alliances. what happens then when Europe is dealing with China and trade comes in the way, or what happens when Europe is buying Russian gas?
Well, look, those are great questions. Look, I think part of what happened, I said at the outset, we're now talking about the end of liberalism. We were talking 30 years ago about the end of history. And that was in retrospect, that was a silly position. The idea that the entire world was going to become a free and democratic society, there was no evidence for that at that particular point in time. There was certainly a movement in that direction, but I would argue there was never any evidence that China was moving towards being a free and democratic society at all. What happened, though, as a consequence of that worldview, was that we embarked in an era of globalization where both governments and private actors came to a conclusion that you could do trade across different governance models and, frankly, across different security alignments with little or no investment or security risk whatsoever, that whatever risks there were declining, minimal, negligible. And we have seen, by the way, not just through the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen in the pandemic, that those assumptions were extremely naive, that both our governments and our corporations are going to have to shorten global supply chains, they're going to have to shorten investment chains, and they're going to have to take into account the real security risks that different governance models and different national interests sometimes present to our populations.
Right. Jay Panda, India is doing a tough balancing act with this war being on while pursuing national interest. Would you call it strategic autonomy or strategic ambiguity? And you spoke about Prime Minister Modi's policies. How is Modi's India different from the past in its dealings with the world?
I'm going to put this in the context of something you mentioned a little bit earlier as to how can nations come together in dealing with the challenges of the 21st century. And I'd like to say that first and foremost, we have to engage with and dispense with hypocrisy. If we don't do that, it's going to be very difficult to come and work together. When nations who buy more energy from Russia in an afternoon feel free to moralize to nations who buy less than that in a month, they may be playing to their own audience, but there are billions of people who will not buy into that. When nations condemn a conflict of almost an identical nature that they themselves have executed over the decades. I mean, we can use 1930s as a reference point, but to use that as the sole reference point when these very same nations in the 1950s have overthrown democratically elected governments. These very same countries in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, have done that again and again and again, sometimes with UN concurrence, but sometimes without. So until and unless we get rid of that hypocrisy, it's going to be difficult to come together. So as far as India is concerned, I will be very, very clear. It is not strategic ambiguity. I define modern India as having transitioned away from diffidence into an era of confidence. We had a post-colonial era of many decades of diffidence, whether it came to our business people, whether it came to Indians going around the world. Today, we have a confidence. This year, yet again, India is going to be the fastest growing among the large economies. It has been widely recognized as one of the major economic engines of the world. This hasn't happened accidentally. It has happened by taking a lot of, bringing about a lot of fundamental reforms that have happened in the last, you've had more fundamental structural reform in India in the last 8 years than you've had in the previous 70. So finally, I'd like to conclude by saying this. India's rise, and I say this with humility, I've been around the world and met friends from countries across the world. India's rise is viewed very positively. India is viewed as a non-threatening, collaborative nation that is rediscovering its strength economically and collaborating with others. Just recently, for instance, when India has decided to up its role in aiding other countries, we've been aiding countries in our neighborhood that have fallen very badly due to debt trap diplomacy. We are helping them out. In expanding this further, we aren't doing it unilaterally. We aren't doing it with an intention to take control of those countries' economies and geopolitics. We are doing it in it's being called trilateral because it's not just going to be India and that country. It's going to be other nations participating with us. So I think India is playing its cards carefully and correctly, as all nations do, keeping their own national interests. But our own historical, civilizational consciousness of working with the rest of the world together for a common future is on record throughout history.
Carl Beale, to your comments on the need to dispense with hypocrisy.
Well, you could of course say, and here we are going into the politics of the day as well, you can say that, well, others have been sinning in the past, so we have the right to be sinners now. Well, you never become a saint by the sins of others. And of course we have a situation where other nations have been doing mistakes in the past, but that, if you are a nation that wants to uphold certain principles, that can never be an excuse for you doing the same mistakes or violating the same principles. That, I think, is fairly fundamental. What we go back also to the question how we deal with all the authoritarian regimes. Of course, we have been trading with, take Sweden. We've been trading with the Soviet Union. We trade with China. We trade with all sorts of dubious people sometimes, but we are very much insisting of the rules of the game, that we have a world order that is regulated by certain principles, by certain rules, by certain standards, and by global institutions, however imperfect they are. But we try to build them even more perfect, if that is possible, and to uphold them. And that is also why it's so important to react when nations suddenly sort of opt out of the system, say that we don't respect fundamental rules of the international games, and the most fundamental rule of the game is that you don't invade other countries, you respect the territorial integrity. Then you must react. And then I don't think you can say that others have been violated that in the past. That is certainly true. Even Sweden, by the way. But you have to go back quite a number of hundreds of years to go back to the 30 Years' War or something like that. But that was a slightly different world. We are now in a situation where we are much closer together in the world, where we need to have rules of the game. We need to have a rules-based order as much as we can, and I think it is for call ourselves liberal or call ourselves democratic or whatever, we have that fundamental interest of defending the rules that can be defended, the rules that must be defended, and to be fairly strong against those that are violating those particular rules. Because if we don't uphold the rules, then it's going to be the laws of the jungle, and we'll all be the victims of that.
Like you said, the challenge is to uphold principles while also financially strengthening the regimes whose values you do not necessarily espouse. Jean Hall-Lute, he also spoke about multilateral institutions and however imperfect they may be, those who believe in liberalism upholding those institutions. But in a world as polarized as ours, when competing agendas make consensus almost impossible on most subjects, what purpose do multilateral institutions like the UN serve?
I was struck when Carl was speaking that by the famous saying that every saint has a past, every sinner has a future. So it's never too late to start doing the right thing. I mean, one of the things I think we're witnessing is that governments have lost the corner on the market on the three things that really used to define their competency: the control of lethality, the control of capital, and the control of rulemaking. And the international institutions, the multilateral institutions, as a result, they're straining under the weight of unmet expectations. In fact, I think institutions everywhere are straining under the weight of unmet expectations. How do we get out of the toxicity of the deep, whether it's an ideological divide, an emotional divide, how do we get out of that toxicity? I only know one way, and that's for winners to be generous. I think politics the world over the past several decades has sent a message If you lose, you're screwed. So we better not lose, because if we lose, we're screwed. And what we need to do is change that narrative. And winners need to learn how to be generous in the context of not only democracy. Again, I think democracy is thriving. Everybody's voting everywhere. It's liberalism that's under strain. And if we're going to be generous, it needs to be, in my view, and I agree with Carl here, and also, frankly, with Stephen, that the underpinnings, the liberal underpinnings of the international order, which give equal access under the law, ought to be a first principle preserved.
Right. I think we have, 15 odd minutes left. Let's take the questions from the audience.
Yes, absolutely.
You'll have to come to this mic to ask your question, otherwise I'm the one who's going to be asking it. So can you, those who have raised their hand can walk to the mic? The mic there, right in front of
Yeah,
you.
we'll
There are
start with the
number of
Raisina
mics.
Young Fellows.
So Raisina Young Fellows, questions? Go ahead.
Okay. Hello. Okay. So I can just say, okay. I'm delegate from Taiwan. I'm Bei Fanling, the Deputy Secretary General of DPP, the current governing party of Taiwan. It's very emotional to hear what you're talking about today, because we now the liberal democracies is threatened by autocracy. It's not just the war we saw in Ukraine, but also we saw that the autocracy is trying to use every ways or means, methods to undermine democracies. We saw that China used the disinformation campaign against Taiwan. They used military threats, flying over 1,000 fighter jets to Taiwan's ADIZ. That's the everyday life of Taiwan. We saw that these threats it's become more and more serious. But how can we deal with that? How can world democracies really fighting against these autocracies' expansion? That's something that we need to think about. I'm 33 years old. I got a chance to become a Deputy Secretary General of the ruling party in Taiwan. But I'm living in a democracy, a democratization process. Actually, I born after the martial law has been eased. So I live in the liberal democracy of Taiwan, but now, just 33 years old, my age, and it's similarly to the age of Taiwan's democracy, is under threat right now. So I'm curious that...
I'm sorry to interrupt. We want to pack in more questions. What is your question? And
so I want to ask that the speakers, both speakers, if Taiwan's getting threatened by China directly through the military way or through different methods, will the world democracies stand with Taiwan? Thank you.
Who would like to take it? Yeah? If Taiwan is attacked, will the world democracy stand up for it? Is that the question? Right?
If I may, what's emerging from this talk is that it is not common democratic values that really unite us, but you may see democracy is more likely to unite when their national interests are threatened. And I think this is where mearsheimer carries away the day. You will see that in almost, because even now you're discussing using Russia to beat down China. So what we're talking about really are national interests, and that's not anything to be embarrassed about. And in that whole panoply of powers that we've been talking about, one power emerges from the long history of what people think is a discredited Cold War. Only the United States has ever invested so much treasure and blood to defend an ideal, whether you like their wars or not, but it was for democracy. You cannot point at any other Western power, or any other power for that matter. Now, when you mentioned Taiwan, for some of us who are old democracies, we remember that we had turned our backs on China. Well, it was already China to us, but we had allied ourselves with Taiwan, but we do remember one thing, that in the middle of the night, Taiwanese authorities came to the Philippines and kidnapped two Chinese Filipino publishers and detained them in the garrison state. That is indelible. So it was in the interest of Chiang Kai-shek at that moment to do that. So it's going to be a little hard for us now to think of Taiwan in anything like democratic light. But I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Stephen Hawking.
Could I just maybe try and answer the question directly? The honest truth is I don't know whether the world would defend a democracy in Taiwan if it were really under threat. And part of that is because of the ambiguous nature of Taiwan's international status. But I would say that I would hope the world would defend it because, you know, I think it's important that we take a look at Taiwan and China. And we talk about, in many ways rightly, we talk about the tremendous achievement that China has seen in the last 40 years in terms of, under its system, which is far from being a free and democratic society, raising the living standards of ordinary people. And you say that's impressive. On the other hand, you can look across the Taiwan Strait and see that under a free and democratic model, not only was that achieved, but the standards of living reached for people were 2 to 3 times higher and growing more quickly. And so I think that's why that model is important. And I don't think we should ever forget why the People's Republic considers Taiwan such a threat. It is not because Taiwan can overthrow the government in China or because Taiwan threatens the disintegration of China. These arguments are nonsense. It's because Taiwan's existence and success puts a lie to the argument that China's authoritarian order is necessary for its progress.
Mm-hmm. If I can just respond. Taiwan's a close phenomenon to the Philippines. What I do remember is that Taiwan's growth from the time Chiang Kai-shek crossed the straits was basically directed by the United States, the USAID, with great success, but it was an authoritarian regime. It was authoritarianism that decided what would be produced, how much of it, in what areas. They had a complete direction. Later on, when Chiang Kai-shek died, the son took over, then democracy could come in, and the argument was now you can afford democracy. But it wasn't democracy that built Taiwanese prosperity. It was dictatorship.
And you spoke about U.S. fighting wars to uphold values.
Yes,
and oil.
Yeah, I'll tell you, because for them, it mattered to them, it was because it was the last redoubt of something that could still become democratic. They did the same in Vietnam. The United States in Vietnam, was in Vietnam not in order to occupy that country. They couldn't wait to get out. They just, when they took the Philippines, for example, in 1898, the first reaction was, let's sell it to Germany. But then they said, no, wait, we have a democratic obligation. So far, I cannot see a single power in the world or in history that ever makes those commitments and pays for it at such a high price. It's a unique phenomenon.
Right. I think America's wars are a debate for another day. We'll take another question. Here.
May I, I'm Chris Zalewski, I'm from Poland, and that's my question now. I think the very basics for liberalism and any kind of liberal order is the maintaining of peace. And I also, in this debate, we are debating the current war in Ukraine or the possible war on Taiwan. Do we have any possibility to return to a more peaceful world, and what are the steps you would see as needed to go into this direction? Thank you.
Who is this question for?
It was general for all speakers because we all debate the liberalism and war, as I understand.
Right. Carl Bildt, yes.
Well, to say, go back to the fundamentals. I think there are some fundamentals of the international order that must be respected for us to be able to then progress towards peace or democracy or whatever. And the fundamental is respect for the territory, for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Because if we allow powers that consider themselves to be somewhat greater than others to violate the rights of others, that's a process without an end. And that's a process that is going to lead to disorder, turmoil, and war. So that fundamental principle, and go back even more fundamentally, if you go back to the Second World War, and what happened after that, Nuremberg, Tokyo war trials, where they really went over the questions, what are the rules? They said that the number one, the supreme international crime, was the crime of aggression. And they convicted the leaders of Germany and they convicted the leaders of Japan for having violated that particular supreme rule of international order. And I think that is fairly fundamental, because if we take war off the table, then we can go for all of these other issues that we need to deal with. The human rights, the trade, the economic, the social development of nations. But if war is a threat all the time, because that fundamental principle is violated, then everything else is in danger.
Jay Banda.
I'd like to just take on from there a little bit. This idea that the world must be rules-based, of course, is unexceptionable. The reality is whose rules and from when? Now, the largest multilateral bodies, such as the UN, have been structured in an era which doesn't exist anymore. When the largest democracy in the history of humankind can be excluded from the highest decision-making bodies in the world, how do those rules apply and to whom? And when, for example, we take different stands, we can talk about conflicts, but let's talk about terrorism, which is an ongoing threat around the world for decades. If terrorism is not a big issue unless it hits you in your homeland, if terrorism is not a big issue because you have client states with whom you have to maintain relations, even though they specifically pump in state-sponsored terror across international borders, there are no rules. So to have a rules-based world, we must re-look at the rules and adapt them and shape them for the realities of the 21st century.
Jane.
So I would agree. I guess I have children, so I'm much more interested in looking forward than looking back. Can we go back? I mean, if we see conflict in the world today, it really takes one of three forms. There's either no order, to your point about terrorism, it's contested order, or it's alternative order. Let's put in a new system. And what's the basis for that? I mean, there have to be some fundamental principles on which we can agree. Some of those principles are enshrined in the Charter, and the territorial integrity of states and the illegitimacy of the use of force against one state against another. Is it violated all the time? It's violated all the time. But what are we going to do about it? How do we construct a world in which we can all breathe free and have governments responsible and answerable to the people? I mean, one of the things about democracy that distinguishes it from mob rule, I mean, if we think about democracy, it's everybody voting about things. And it comes back to, again, who's we? Who gets the franchise? And one of the things that distinguishes democracy as we understand it in the world today from mob rule is the underpinning of liberal values, individual rights, freedoms, equal treatment under the law. We must come back to the law, and we must come back, if we're going to change the law, if we're going to change the rules, then we need a system under which we all feel enfranchised to make those changes.
We have 2 minutes. I'm not sure if we can, yes, one question, one final.
Milena Lazarevic, European Policy Center, Belgrade. A question for Ms. Lut or whoever else would like to comment on the panel. You mentioned the importance of winners being generous to the losers. Now, a lot of the neo-realist thinkers in the US claim, and this is not my personal opinion, I would like to be very clear about that, but they claim that one of the reasons that Putin has become so strong in Russia is because the US was not generous enough towards the Soviet Union when it appeared as the clear winner in the Cold War. What is your answer to that, and what are, let's say, the main arguments against the neoliberals' claims?
The United States is not responsible for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
No, and let me also ask a comment on that one. The debate in Europe at the moment is rather the other way around. If you look at the debate in Germany, is rather they've been too generous to Russia. Because by sort of agreeing to buy all of the Russian gas for decades, they have been financing the regime of Mr. Putin. So the debate, I agree with you, that particular argument has been advanced, particularly in the US debate, but in the European debate, the debate at the moment is one has been too generous in financing the regime of Putin during the past few decades.
Yeah, let me just add this. I sat at many meetings of the G8 and of NATO for years and years, and I witnessed on the part of the United States and all of the allies every attempt to bring Russia into the most senior councils of our alliance. This wasn't just done with all the countries of Eastern Europe that are now proud members of NATO, proud members of the European Union, etc. But there was a particular outreach. I witnessed it by George W. Bush. I witnessed it by multiple leaders over long periods of time to embrace Russia, to include Russia, to make Vladimir Putin, frankly, to make a democratically elected Russian president a major player in our alliance, and he decided he did not want to be that. He decided he would rather be an enemy of freedom and democracy and a rival to the Western world when he had every chance to do it otherwise.
Right, we won't be able to take more questions. The big board there says time's up, but I can quickly recap what we've taken away from this session, that as much as countries want to uphold shared value systems, what they really pursue is national interest, and that's nothing to be embarrassed about. And democracy is thriving, but it's liberalism that is under strain, and for it to be revived, it is important to do away with hypocrisy. I think that in one line sums up this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and join me in applauding the wonderful panel.